We must indeed confront the deficit, but not as the Republicans now propose, tearing apart what has helped create the fabric of the American middle class. I yield back.
Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, the President submitted a budget that never balances. In fact, it doubles and triples the debt. It went to the United States Senate and 97 to nothing. 97 to nothing. Not one Democrat voted in favor of that. Has the President submitted any sort of adjustment or amendment to that? No, he has not. The reality is this President has no plan. We have a plan. We can solve the underlying problem and take care of paying our bills on August 2nd. With that, I would like to recognize the gentleman from California, member of the Budget Committee, Mr. McClintock, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this vote stands as a defining moment in this crisis. Every rating agency has warned that an increase in the debt limit without a credible plan to balance the budget will do great damage to our nation's credit. And worse, fiscal experts warn that without such a plan, we risk a sovereign debt crisis within the next 2 years. This measure gives the President everything he's asked for, the $2.4 trillion debt increase to pay for the bills that he and the Congress have recklessly racked up. But it also calls for a constitutionally enforceable workout plan to place our nation back on the course to fiscal solvency, the centerpiece of which is a balanced budget amendment that's been proposed in one form or another since the birth of our Constitution and that 49 other states have adopted. Now, the gentleman from Maryland reminds us that only a few of those 49 states have both a balanced budget requirement and a two-thirds vote for tax increases. My home state of California happens to be one of them. California's deficits, as bad as they are, have been proportionally roughly half the size of those that the federal government has run up in the same period. These budget protections work, maybe not perfectly, but they do work. And I might add that when California also had a real spending limit, as this measure calls for, California enjoyed an era of balanced budgets, prudent reserves, no tax increases, and steady economic growth.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair would advise the gentleman from Utah his time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Gentleman from Vermont.
Maryland. We face two immediate challenges. The first is, will we pay our bills? That's the whole issue of raising the deficit or the debt limit. America pays its bills. It's as simple as that. If we owe veterans who served this country their benefits, they're going to get paid. If we went to a war and didn't pay for it and fund it when we went, we have to pay that bill when it becomes due. That is the question. It is not right. And it's, by the way, a Republican iconic figure, Ronald Reagan, was the one who was familiar with tax and budget fights, who said he would never make the debt ceiling, America's full faith and credit, a hostage to a point of view, and did the right thing to pay those bills. The second issue that we face, and I acknowledge my Republican colleagues for their focus on this, is a long-term fiscal plan. The bill that we've brought before the floor, a balanced budget amendment, raises the question, is it an effective tool, or is the better approach a balanced approach to revenues and to spending? The state of Vermont does not have a balanced budget amendment. Yet in Vermont, we pay our bills and we balance our budget. We do it, number one, by working together. And one of the points that the rating agencies have made is the apprehension here is not so much our ability to pay our bills, it's our ability to work together. Working together requires that we have a balance of cuts, look at that budget, where can we save money, but it also requires that we have a balance of revenues, because part of the goal here, again, of a confident country is to grow our economy. That requires investment in infrastructure, in education, in new industries. And if we are going to be successful, this cannot be just cuts. It has to be balanced with investments that will grow this economy, grow jobs, bring that unemployment rate down. We can do it together. I see the gentleman from South Carolina included in his approach, cutting the Pentagon. That has to be on the table. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize for 30 minutes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do need to correct my colleague from Vermont. I'm not from South Carolina. I'm from Florida, but that's okay. I'm the guy with hair. I would like to start off by saying this very simply. I rise in support of H.R. 2560 because when I look back in the few years, 2007 to 2011, 8.67 trillion, 10.4 trillion, now we're at about 14.5 trillion in debt. From 2009 to 2011, 1.42 trillion, 1.29 trillion, and an estimated 1.65 trillion in deficits. The President's budget of fiscal year 2012, 0 to 97. 800-plus days the Senate Democrats have not passed a budget. $1 trillion of wasteful spending of the stimulus. We still have unemployment at 9.2% nationally, 16.2% in the black community, and 13% of my brothers and sisters that are coming back from combat zones are unemployed. Our debt to GDP ratio is about 70%. Our government spending to GDP ratio is 24.4%. 47% of our debt is owned by foreign nations, 27% with China. We are going in the wrong direction. I stand in support of H.R. 2560 because this is insanity, and we cannot continue to do the same thing and expecting different results. And I yield back.
Expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would again remind my colleagues that the last time we were running a budget surplus was during the years of the Clinton administration. During that period of time, our spending was at a level that was higher than would be limited by the limitation in here, and we were paying our obligations. And what this would do would create an anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic provision in the Constitution that says you can't balance your budget at 19% of GDP, even if that's the will of the American people, even if it's how we did it back during the Clinton administration. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 2 minutes to distinguished gentlelady, member of the Budget Committee, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlelady from Florida. 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 2560, which attempts to manipulate the Constitution in order to impose a Ryan budget plan on steroids. This is yet another thinly veiled attempt by our colleagues across the aisle to end Medicare as we know it, while refusing to even consider ending ill-advised tax breaks for millionaires. It is crucial that the American people understand that this plan would require even deeper cuts than under the Ryan Republican plan we saw in April. This means deeper cuts to investments in education, clean energy, and increased costs for our seniors. President Obama has vowed to veto this bill, which ends the Medicare guarantee, and incredulously, the gentleman from Florida, who represents thousands of Medicare beneficiaries, as do I, is supportive of this plan that would increase costs for Medicare beneficiaries, unbelievable from a member from South Florida. It slashes Medicaid and critical investments essential to winning the future in favor of protecting tax breaks for big oil, millionaires, and companies who ship American jobs overseas. Achieving a solution to America's fiscal challenges is absolutely an economic necessity, but the only way to achieve a real solution is through shared sacrifice. We can't ask our seniors, working Americans, and students to bear the burden of our deficits when we're asking nothing of corporations, special interests, and the wealthiest few. Incredibly, our friends across the aisle won't even put that on the table. The nonpartisan CBO, Congressional Budget Office, has said that the #1 policy decision that brought us to the need to prevent the nation from defaulting on our debt for the first time in history were the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 that disproportionately benefited the wealthiest Americans. Yet here we are again, rewarding the most privileged at the expense of our working families and our seniors, the bedrock of our society. Cut, cap, and balance may make for a great soundbite, but it would have a devastating impact on our economy and American seniors. It is clearly more like duck, dodge, and dismantle. For the sake of our economy, it is essential that we move beyond politics, as usual, and take action to reduce our nation's deficit and get our fiscal house in order. On behalf of the 102,000 Medicare beneficiaries in my home district, and on behalf of all middle-class Americans, I urge my colleagues to join me in opposition to this reckless bill and pass a balanced plan that engages us all in shared sacrifice to solve our nation's debt crisis. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself at this point 1.5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I rise today in support of a plan, an actual plan to address our fiscal crisis, to cut, cap, and balance. You know, Mr. Speaker, with our plan now toppling $14 trillion, we have no other choice but to start sending clear, immediate signals to the marketplace and the world that we are serious about spending and debt reform. And to show that we are serious, we need to put skin in the game in the form of immediate spending cuts today, caps on spending that occurs tomorrow, and the balanced budget amendment to protect us from spending too much in the future. You know, I find it interesting that the proponents of a debt limit increase without any substantial reforms point to the so-called financial meltdown type scenarios of failing to raise the debt limit by August 2nd. You know, we hear that interest rates for U.S. Treasuries would skyrocket, causing the cost of servicing current debt to increase, which in turn would require more borrowing and disastrous consequences for the federal budget and also the global economy. But you know what the other side fails to mention in any of these scenarios is what would happen if we don't get spending under control. The challenge is clear. What are the solutions, though, to it? House Republicans today are demonstrating that we are committed to confronting our country's addiction to spending and debt with bold and decisive action and with actually a plan in place. Cut, cap, and balance plan is not only the right prescription to address our fiscal crisis, it is the only plan on the table that makes structural changes to right our fiscal ship. As a matter of fact, it's the only plan in place. Nobody wants to raise the debt ceiling, but if it's going to be raised, we should use it as what? An opportunity to finally implement comprehensive reform measures to ensure that we will never find this situation again, because if we do nothing, if we put off the tough decisions for another day, the only one to blame is ourselves. This is our moment. This is our time to act. I thank the Speaker, and with this, I yield now 2 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana.
Gentleman from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been very interesting listening to this debate so far. I want to add a couple points to it. First of all, I would note for the record that this government is spending $7 million a minute. We are borrowing $3 million a minute of that $7 million. This is money that most Americans will never see in a lifetime, and we are spending that much in a minute. Now, as I listened to the debate so far, I couldn't help but wonder, Mr. Speaker, what is this president, what are the Democrats so very scared of? Why are they scared of letting the balanced budget amendment go to the people of this country? Let's be clear. Voting for this bill starts a balanced budget amendment process, not the implementation of the amendment. So why are they so scared of the people of this country? Well, if you believe that government, if you believe that elites can make better decisions for the people of this country than the people can, if you believe that they should be controlling the people's money, their property, better than the people can, well, no wonder they're scared. Because overwhelmingly, the people of this country would say to us exactly what they say around the kitchen table, and that is we have to live within our means. The second point, Mr. Speaker, and then I'll yield back. This is the first time that I can tell in the history of this republic that this kind of debt has been racked up with no intention and no plan to pay it back. This is the first time. And quite frankly, I don't know of anything more piggish or un-American than racking up a bill to be passed on to our best asset, our future, our kids, just so that we can have more on our plate now, just so that we can have more largesse, just so we can be more selfish in the here and now and kick that can down the road to let our kids pay for it. Since when has that become part of American exceptionalism? Since when has that attitude become part of this country? I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I know that the gentleman is new to the body, but there were lots of decisions made over the past years for which the bills are coming due now. For example, in 2005, when our Republican colleagues headed up the House, we passed a prescription drug add-on to Medicare, which was not funded, not one penny, It was all put on the credit card. 2 wars that were put on the credit card, and again, tax cuts in 2001, 2003 that disproportionately benefited the very wealthy that create this gap. So I agree with the gentleman. It is time to take responsibility for our actions, and it's interesting to hear some folks say that it's a sacrifice for us to have to pay bills for decisions that were made in the past. Now, yes, we need to get the deficit under control. And again, the President of the United States has put on the table a balanced approach over 10 years, $3 in spending cuts to $1 in revenue, and again, our Republican colleagues have walked away from the table because they don't want to raise 1 penny of revenue from closing corporate tax loopholes. Just to be clear, the President's plan would extend middle-class tax cuts beyond 2013. The President's plan would say, let's extend the payroll tax cut for 2012. But he says, let's get serious about our deficit and let's do it in a balanced way with shared responsibility. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, members of the Ways and Means Committee, who knows a lot about the importance of shared responsibility, Mr. Lewis.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, the American people are sick and tired of Washington petty games. People's lives, their home, their retirement, their health care are hanging in the balance. The American people are good, strong, resilient people. They are willing to sacrifice to get our country back on track, but they will not be played as fools. Middle-class Americans know they are not getting a fair shake. This bill protects tax break for the wealthiest American, while the middle class pay more than their fair share and watch their retirement savings disappear. The American people know that there is a deliberate, systematic attempt to destroy Medicare, to damage Medicaid, and threaten Social Security. This is ducking, dodging, and destroying. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it must be a duck. The American people want one thing. They want jobs, good jobs, jobs that pay the bill, give people back their dignity, and get people back on track with the American dream. Our nation deserves nothing less. But this bill will destroy those hopes and those dreams. It will plunge our economy back into a deeper recession. It will mean more lost jobs, more lost homes, and seniors living in poverty without health care and basic necessity. It will mean children going hungry, and it will keep smart young people from going off to college. This bill will sell the very soul of our nation. We as Americans are better than this. We are more compassionate than this. We know better. It is easier to destroy than it is to build. Another generation of leaders did more with less and built people up. We cannot turn back. Vote no on this bill. Let's go back to the table and work out a compromise that prevent default, preserve our moral obligation to our seniors, put America back on the road to greatness. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from New Jersey.
I yield now 1 minute to the gentlelady who is concerned not only about the soul of the nation today, but the soul of the nation for our posterity as well, who is not willing to duck the hard issues.
Gentlelady from Michigan.
Ms. Miller.
Mr. Speaker, after years, literally years of growing government and increasing spending beyond all reason, it is now long past time to bring fiscal sanity to Washington and to put America on a path to prosperity. And today, Mr. Speaker, our national debt has increased, and it's exceeded now $14 trillion, and our debt has increased by almost $4 trillion, which is more than $120 billion a month in new debt just since President Obama has been in office. $120 billion each and every month with this new president. Government has grown so large that it now spends nearly 25% of our annual economic output, a level not seen since World War II. That's crowded out, of course, private sector growth and new jobs and opportunities that Americans need and are demanding. This plan puts forward real cuts to spending, no smoke, no mirrors. It enforces discipline with real caps on spending and a balanced budget amendment. And it gives the President the increase in the debt ceiling that he is seeking if the balanced budget amendment is sent to the states. Mr. Speaker, I would urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this common-sense reform. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Before recognizing the gentleman from Maryland, the Chair would just advise somehow the time got out of whack here a little bit, and just for time management purposes, the majority has 1 hour and 24 minutes, and the minority has 59 minutes. And so just sort of for budgeting purposes, the Chair would recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Well, with that, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that our Republican colleagues go next, if that's all right.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
So at this time, I will yield 1 minute to gentleman from North Carolina.
Gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble.
Mr. Speaker, many members of recent sessions of Congress have not been known as practitioners of fiscal discipline. Balanced budget amendment philosophy has well served thousands of governmental entities and hundreds of thousands of households. Now is the time for the Congress to embrace a balanced budget amendment, which will then set us up on a course where fiscal discipline is not merely an option, but a necessity. Only then, Mr. Speaker, will the Congress balance its own budget. I urge support of this worthwhile and common sense piece of legislation and would like to see it enacted, although that probably will not be the conclusion. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland want to continue to reserve?
Yes.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute to speak on this common sense piece of legislation.
Gentleman from Texas.
I thank my colleague from New Jersey for the time. Mr. Speaker, there are 2 reasons why this is the most important vote of my 2.5 years in Congress. Their names are Kate and Grant Olson. They're my children. Kay's 14 and Grant is 11. And my wife Nancy and I uprooted them from the only home that they knew, moved back to my home state of Texas to run for Congress because we were worried that the ever-increasing federal debt was the greatest threat to their future. Today, for the first time in my children's young lives, the House of Representatives is passing game-changing legislation that puts our nation on a path to fiscal sanity and ensures that my Kate, my Grant, your Kates, and your Grants have better lives than we did. I urge my colleagues to make a down payment on the future of America's youth and vote in support of H.R. 2560. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just ask my Republican colleagues to consider why they want to write a provision into the Constitution of the United States that would make it harder to shut down a special interest tax loophole for the purpose of reducing the deficit for our children and grandchildren. And now I would yield 4 minutes to our very distinguished Democratic whip and my colleague from the state of Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland.
I thank my friend, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, Mr. Van Hollen, for yielding. The American public are rightfully very distressed with the Congress of the United States. They're distressed at a time of great challenge and great risk that we fiddle while the debt threatens to burn us, to place our country in the position of being adjudged uncredit-worthy. That is not worthy of this Congress or any one of us that serves in this Congress. We have 14 days, according to the Secretary-Treasurer, until such time as America will be unable to pay its obligations, whether to foreigners or to people in this country. That is not a situation that will be looked at positively by the financial sector or by any one of our constituents whose ability to save, to have a 401k that is stable, to purchase an automobile or a refrigerator or send their kid to college will be put at risk because of increased interest rates. Not one of us will be held harmless if this Congress fails to do its duty. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have had a number of efforts to get us to where we needed to be to get back to fiscal responsibility. I'm amused when I hear our new members talk about the fiscal irresponsibility, because I've served here long enough to know that the two presidents under whom the debt was raised most were Ronald Reagan, 186% increase from the $985 billion total debt when Ronald Reagan took office to over $2.8 trillion, and George Bush II, who increased the national debt 86%. Did he do it alone? Of course not. Did we all do it? Republicans and Democrats? Yes. Now, Democrats believe that the debt was raised because we bought things on the Republican watch that were not paid for. That's indisputable. You cannot argue that. Those are the facts. The fact is, did we do the same in the Obama administration? We did. Why? Because we had to respond to the deepest recession we have seen. We didn't create enough jobs. In fact, we lost jobs. So we bring a bill to the floor some weeks ago to address the creditworthiness of the United States of America. And the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee said we offer this bill to fail. Not to solve the problem, to fail. Now we bring a bill to the floor of the House of Representatives this day, 14 days before the debt limit is reached and America might default for the first time in history. This bill was written sometime late Friday or perhaps Saturday. How many of you said, have you read the bill? How many hours have you taken to consider this bill? I've read the bill too, Paul. I guarantee there's not an American who's not on the Budget Committee that reads this bill knows what impact it has, and the chairman of the Budget Committee is shaking his head and agreeing with me. The fact of the matter, you haven't had 1 second of hearing on this. There was no markup on this bill, and it has significant consequences. Now, let me tell you, my friends on the other side of the aisle, I'm one of those who stands in this well who voted for the balanced budget amendment in 1995. Can I have one additional amendment?
Additional minute to the gentleman.
And I voted because I believed we needed to get to fiscal responsibility. And in fact, we did. And we balanced the budget 4 years in a row, and George Bush inherited a $5.6 trillion projected surplus, not debt, not deficit, and 22 million jobs having been created before he took office. And 8 years later, we had increased the debt by $5 trillion. Now, I'm not going to vote for the balanced budget amendment, and I urge my colleagues to reject this bill, which has no chance of passage. And we need to stop fiddling, and we need to do our work and make sure America can pay its debts. Because if it can't, every one of our constituents will lose, and our country will lose. Our oath of office was to preserve and protect. Defeat this ill-advised, ill-timed, unconsidered piece of legislation, and let us move to fiscal responsibility in a way that will bring us all together in a bipartisan way, as Bowles Simpson tried to do, as Biden tried to do, and as, frankly, Mr. Boehner and the President tried to do. Let's get to that objective. The country deserves it.
Members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair and not to others, either in the first or second person. The gentleman from New Jersey.
And I thank the Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia who recognized that if the balanced budget amendment was appropriate back in 1995, with debt now reaching over $14 trillion today, how much more so is it relevant to pass today? The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Here we are. We are at the moment of choosing. And we just heard from the former leader of the former majority party that we need to oppose this. But you know, to those in the gallery here today, to those watching on camera, just in a few hours, you will get the opportunity to see behind me on this board every name of every member of Congress and how they vote. They will make a choice. They will take their voting card of which you've entrusted us with, and they will make a decision. This nation should balance its budget or not. This isn't so much about cut, cap, balance. This is about prosperity or continued high unemployment. That would be green for prosperity, red for high unemployment. This is about accountability and constraints. Green or Washington run wild. Again, that'd be the red button in the status quo. This is about sustainability of our future or continued uncertainty as we've seen thus far. Or better yet, this is about standing on our own, the green button, independence of this great nation, or continued and increasing bondage of foreign nations in our indebtedness, again, the red button. Members of Congress, this is your time of choosing. We've heard so many names invoked here today, former presidents, members of Congress, other Congresses, but guess what? This is your time. This is your choice. This is your voting card. What will you choose? A prosperous future for this nation or continue the status quo? I urge my members, let's choose a great, prosperous future for this nation. America deserves it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlemen, as time has expired, members are again reminded to address their remarks to the chair. It's inappropriate to address the people in the gallery and also to refer to others in the second person. The gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is a time for choosing. We have to reduce our deficit. We have to get the budget into balance. The question is how we do this. And we believe that it is a corruption of the Constitution to write into the Constitution itself a provision that says a majority vote can cut Medicare and Social Security, but you need a two-thirds undemocratic vote to close a corporate tax loophole for the purpose of reducing the deficit. And with that, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady of California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlelady from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First, let me thank the gentleman for yielding and for his outstanding leadership. I rise in strong opposition to what has been appropriately been labeled as the duck, dodge, and dismantle budget bill. The Republicans duck making the hard choices by requiring us to actually amend our Constitution before we can act to avoid default. The end result, America fails to pay its bills on time. The Republicans dodge facing the real challenge by continuing tax breaks for the super wealthy and big oil, funding two wars and other Republican interests. And the Republicans want to dismantle our nation's economic security for seniors, the disabled, and the poor by cutting Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Making heartless cuts on the backs of the most vulnerable will not balance the budget, and it's morally wrong. Now, with only 14 days left, Republicans are pushing forward legislation that will guarantee a default and will kill hundreds of thousands of jobs. This duck, dodge, and dismantle bill would end the social safety net, kill jobs, and set our nation back rather than move it forward. I urge my colleagues to oppose this job-killing bill that would end up being written in stone, mind you, in our Constitution. It turns the American dream into a nightmare.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Speaker. And just to remind the other side of the aisle that with regard to the radical plan that we talk about here with regarding into changing or amending the Constitution, it was Thomas Jefferson who said in a letter to John Taylor, "I wish that it were possible to obtain just a single amendment to our Constitution. I'd be willing to depend on that alone, that our government would return to the genuine principles of the Constitution." And he was speaking, of course, of what we're doing here today, what Thomas Jefferson wished that we had done over 200 years ago, a balanced budget amendment. And with that, I yield now 2 minutes. Gentlelady from Washington.
Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in strong support of H.R. 2560 to address our national debt. In 2006, then Senator Barack Obama voted against raising the debt ceiling, and he said at that time that the rising national debt was a sign of leadership failure. Today, President Barack Obama is asking Congress to raise the national debt $2.4 trillion, largely to fund many of the programs that he's had passed in the last couple of years. And to put that into perspective, that amounts to $20,000 for every American family. Congress is being asked to add $20,000 in debt burden to every American family, and we owe it to them before we raise that debt to make sure we are cutting up the credit cards and that we are not going to continue to spend beyond our means. House Republicans are committed to getting our fiscal house in order. House Republicans are committed to protecting our excellent credit rating. It is the national debt that threatens our credit rating. The bill before us today, Cut, Cap, and Balance, is a credible plan to address this situation. It will cut spending immediately, it will enact spending caps, and it will require the passage of a balanced budget amendment. 49 out of 50 states balance their budgets. The President's spend, borrow, bailout policies have clearly failed, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. Let's help America's economy today, and let's keep the American dream alive for many years to come. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would hazard a guess that Thomas Jefferson would not want to write into the Constitution of the United States anti-democratic provisions that said you need 2/3 in order to close special interest tax loopholes for the purpose of deficit reduction, or to say that we're going to decide now for all time that we have to balance our budget at 18% of GDP rather than some other number that may be the will of the American people. And with that, I would inquire as to how the time is currently allocated.
The gentleman from New Jersey has 17.5 minutes remaining, and then there's an additional hour on the other side. And the gentleman from Maryland now has 51.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I would reserve time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New Jersey. Mr. Garrett.
For this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2560, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. The severity of our nation's fiscal crisis cannot be overstated. More than 14 million Americans are looking for work. Meanwhile, federal spending continues at an unprecedented pace, with an average of $4 billion added to our country's debt every day. We need to encourage economic growth and investment. Instead, leaders on the other side of the aisle are pushing more reckless policies, more red tape, and more taxes to pay for their irresponsible spending spree, leaving job creators frozen by uncertainty and fear and risking our future prosperity. At a recent roundtable in Minnesota, a small business owner told me, quote, "The government is out of control, it's too big, and I don't like it," close quote. Well, I don't like it either, and it's costing our country jobs. It's time for Washington to do what's right. We need to make the tough choices necessary to get our nation's fiscal house in order. No one said it would be easy, but it certainly is necessary. The legislation before us today will end unsustainable spending and put this nation back on a fiscally responsible path. I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland, reserve, or you? Gentleman from New Jersey.
I appreciate that. And just to the gentleman from the other side of the aisle who made the point regarding what sort of amendment that Thomas Jefferson may have been looking for today, whether we actually would be looking for one we call for what we call a supermajority, what have you. In point of fact, I believe Jefferson would be going even further than what we are doing here today and simply say that Congress should not have the ability to borrow at all. The amendment that we're putting forward would actually give us greater flexibility of that in time of emergency, in time of war, that Congress can take it upon themselves to borrow. Jefferson understood that first and foremost that Congress, just like the businesses and families at the time, needed to live within their means, and he saw it as immoral, basically, to take responsibilities of this generation and place them on future generations. And with that, at this time, I will yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arkansas.
Gentleman from Arkansas.
Cut, cap, and balance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I've had the privilege of serving Arkansas's 3rd District now for a little more than 6 months in this Congress, and I can still hear the voices of those people who sent me here. Their voices said, Steve, you've got to go to Washington and you've got to cut spending. You've got to empower the private sector. You have to reduce the size of government. You've got to get to Washington and help put us back to work. Those same conversations at home at the kitchen table, people discussing their personal budgets, saying to me that I have to live within my means. Why doesn't Washington? Mr. Speaker, to each of these comments, I say we have an answer. It's a trifecta, if you will. It's called cut, cap, and balance. Mr. Speaker, I realize I've only been here a short time, but I know full well how Washington works. And I know that this concept is foreign to the many people who have been here down through the years. But if you look around and take an objective view, you'll know that the only way to bring legitimate control to the irresponsible fiscal behavior of Washington, D.C., the only way to restore the integrity of this chamber, to restore the confidence in the people we serve, is to make it constitutional, a balanced budget amendment. No gimmicks, Mr. Speaker, no hollow promises, simple language that rank-and-file Americans can wrap their head around, a constitutional requirement for this country to balance its books. And I yield back.
Yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New Jersey.
At this time, the gentleman from Tennessee. There he is.
Georgia.
From Georgia. For 1 minute, please.
Gentleman from Georgia for a minute.
Half 30 seconds for the wrong state, I mean.
Because,
Can I go a minute and a half?
due to the cadence of his speech, we will yield a minute and a half.
I thank the gentleman from New York. I certainly appreciate it, my friend from New Jersey. You know, during his 8 years as president, President Bush increased the national debt $3 trillion. We spent too much money. But not to be outdone, in a 3-year period of time, President Obama has increased the national debt $5 trillion, a 56% increase. And then he turns around and lectures middle-class American families, struggling families, to eat their peas. He offers no plan, no answers, nothing but a phony budget that even failed in the Democrat-controlled Senate 97-0. Harry Reid voted against his budget. The president owns this economy. Not Halliburton, not Cheney, not George Bush. It's the president's. He owns the skyrocketing debt. He owns the 15 million unemployed. He owns the failed stimulus plan. President Obama owns the extended Bush tax cuts because it was him who extended them 2 years. And now, in our time of great fiscal crisis, when America needs leadership, he's absent. The Republicans in the House are offering a plan. And I understand the Democrats don't like it. That's good, because sometimes the two parties have to battle it out and you get a better product from it. But you can't do it when the Democrats aren't offering a plan. We will pass this plan today, and I hope Harry Reid and the Democrats will pass a plan and we can get together. And I hope the President decides to offer a plan. And maybe we can look at his, and maybe out of the three possibilities we can do what's best for the American people. But we can't do it unless the President decides to engage and take on the role of leader. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, the President had a plan to reduce the deficit by about $4 trillion over 10 years, $3 in cuts, $1 in revenue. Our Republican colleagues walked away from the table because they didn't want to ask $1 of deficit reduction from closing special interest tax loopholes. With that, I yield 3 minutes and 15 seconds to the distinguished member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Nadler.
Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, many of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle would not be here today if President Jefferson had not borrowed to finance the Louisiana Purchase. Mr. Speaker, this bill promises all the fun of a constitutional amendment without actually amending the Constitution. It simply says that the United States should default on our debts and destroy our economy if we don't amend the Constitution. If we default on our debts, we will do more damage to our economy than large deficits, tax increases, and draconian cuts combined. Right now, we enjoy very low interest rates because we are still the most stable, reliable, and wealthy country in the world. If the markets get the idea that we are too dysfunctional to pay our debts, even though we are certainly wealthy enough to do so, nothing else will matter. Interest rates will climb, homeowners and businesses will be pushed out of the credit markets, the stock market will crash. Never before in the history of this country has anyone been irresponsible enough to play chicken with our full faith and credit. Never. We know how to balance the budget because we've done it before. In the not-too-distant past, we managed, working with President Clinton, not only to balance the budget, but to run surpluses and begin paying down the debt. Unfortunately, President Bush and the Republican Congress managed to turn record surpluses into record deficits in record time. Rather than admit to serious Republican economic mismanagement and finding responsible solutions, we get this dusted-off quack cure from the past. The so-called balanced budget amendment requires a balanced budget much sooner than does the Republican budget that the House recently passed, the one that abolishes Medicare and turns Medicaid into a block grant. I asked the sponsor of the balanced budget amendment, the gentleman from Virginia, how he thought this could be done. He answered that the Republican Study Committee budget, which is even more radical than the Ryan budget, would be in balance in just 9 years. That's what we're really voting for today, an accelerated version of the Republican Study Committee budget. Anyone voting for this should be prepared to go home and explain that vote, including Republican members who voted against the Study Committee budget. Economists have long known that in good times you should balance the budget and pay down the debt, but that in times of recession, when tax revenues plummet and the economy contracts, you have to spend money on unemployment insurance and to put people back to work. You must run a deficit to get the economy going again. The balanced budget amendment would force us to do the exact opposite and turn every recession into a depression. And this constitutional amendment does a whole lot more than require a balanced budget. Many of its provisions simply cement into the Constitution the policy preferences of the current majority and bind our children and grandchildren to those preferences. The two-thirds requirement, for example, to increase revenues would have the perverse effect of allowing special interest tax loopholes to be slipped into law with a majority vote, but would require a supermajority to repeal them. This is not just antithetical to a balanced budget, but it would also cement the most corrupt aspects of our tax code into the Constitution. The amendment would also require a two-thirds vote for any budget that exceeds 18% of GDP. The CBO tells us that outlays have averaged close to 21% of GDP over the past 40 years. Federal outlays have not dropped below 18% since 1966. That is, since the enactment of Medicare. Regardless of what other parts of this bill may say, there is no way to meet these restrictions without destroying Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans programs, and military preparedness. Could I have another 15 seconds?
I yield to the gentleman 10 seconds. Okay, Joe.
Thank you. That's just arithmetic, and no amount of rhetoric will change it. The real problem is that tax revenues have declined from 20.5% of GDP in 2000 to 14.5% of GDP because we no longer tax the millionaires, the billionaires, and the large corporations the way we used to. Let's start doing that, and we can have a balanced budget without phony constitutional amendments which promise balanced budgets without showing how, but do protect the millionaires from paying their fair share. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And we were also reminded that Jefferson said in 1816 that sincerely believed that the principle of spending money today that we don't have to be paid for by posterity is but swindling future generations, something this Republican Party does not wish to do. And with that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Ohio.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of H.R. 2560, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act. You know, last November, the American people sent a clear and resounding message. Cut up the nation's credit card and stop spending money we don't have. Today, we're doing that. This act makes immediate spending cuts and forces the federal government to do what Americans all over this country are doing, living within their means. This legislation also begins to cap federal government spending at levels that are historically sustainable to ensure vibrant economic growth. Finally, this measure forces the federal government to do what to most Americans is simply plain common sense. Spend only the amount of money that you have. A balanced budget amendment is long overdue. Republicans have heard the American people's call to action to reduce spending, and that is why I strongly support this measure. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And at this time, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, and that's just the way it is.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today in support of the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act because American families deserve to have a government that lives within its means just like they do. Our national debt has grown in excess of $14 trillion. That's more than $46,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country. And we continue to borrow roughly 40 cents of every dollar we spend. This is a path to financial ruin, and we will leave the next generation with a less prosperous America than the one we inherited. Now, I found on the House floor astonishing that balancing our budget would have a devastating effect on our economy. It's hard to believe. It's been said. The Cut, Cap, and Balance Act keeps the promise we made to the American people to cut spending while also granting the President's request for a debt limit increase. By cutting spending $111 billion the first year alone, capping future spending, and laying the groundwork for a balanced budget amendment, this package will save $5.8 trillion over the next 10 years. This bill is nothing more than good old-fashioned common sense, and I urge my colleagues to support this. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back the balance of his time. Without objection, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Moran, will control the time on the minority. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
And we will reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute, Mr. Scalise.
Gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of Cut, Cap, and Balance. And if you look at what American families have been telling us for the last few years, during these tough economic times, what they've been doing is they've been cutting back. They've been tightening their belts, and they sit around the kitchen table and figure out how to balance their budget and live within their means. And yet today, on the other side, all you've seen is a parade of members coming criticizing the concept of a balanced budget, actually calling it extreme, radical. Imagine that. Only a big spending Washington liberal could think it would be radical to require Washington to start living within its means like families have been doing for years. And so, frankly, American families would say it's about time. Welcome to the party. And instead, some people think you can just live in this fantasy land where you can just keep taxing, spending, borrowing money from China and act like the day of reckoning is never going to come and kick the can down to our children and our grandchildren and make it their problem. Well, it's time to say enough is enough. We're not going to pass this on to the next generation. We're going to deal with our problems today. We're going to set priorities today and do the tough things people sent us to do, and that means cutting, capping, and balancing the federal budget. I yield back.
Has expired. Without objection, the gentleman from Maryland's back and is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the choice is not whether we put in place a plan to reduce the deficit and balance the budget. The issue is how we do that. That is the difference here. With that, I would reserve. All right.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Gentleman from Ohio for 1 minute is ready.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the Cut, Cap, and Balance. Out-of-control spending of the federal government has driven our country to the brink of financial meltdown. Our nation's debt crisis was easily predictable. In recent years, America has watched as the size of the federal government has ballooned and deficit spending reached dangerous levels. And yet, warnings from Congress stuck with business as usual, more spending, more regulations, and bigger government. It's time to put an end to business as usual for the good of the country. Our country needs it, the American people demand it, and the future of our grandchildren depend on it. This legislation puts us on a path of fiscal responsibility, brings certainty, and will restore private sector confidence. The naysayers say we can't do this. They argue for tax increases on our job creators. This measure will unleash the private sector and result in more revenues to ensure strength in Social Security and Medicare and other needed programs. Just raising the debt ceiling with spending cuts reforms, without spending cut reforms, according to Moody's and Standard & Poor's, will probably lead to a downgrade that will, in a U.S. paper and a downhill spiral, higher interest rates, higher taxes, and less opportunities. I urge support of this and cut spending now instead of 6 to 10 years from now.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Maryland. Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from New Jersey.
And with that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida who, while the White House says that leadership is not simply proposing a bill to vote up or down, we recognize that the White House has not given us any plan of leadership so far on this issue. Gentleman from Florida.
Gentleman from Florida.
I ask unanimous consent my entire speech be made part of the record.
Without objection.
It's been said before that the United States government owes close to $14.3 trillion. It estimated by the CBO reveals that by the year 2021, the government will spend 100% of every dollar in revenue on entitlements. Simply raising the debt limit to $16.3 trillion without comparable spending reduction is irresponsible at best and catastrophic for our nation at worst. Forcing our nation spiraling and out-of-control debt onto the backs of our country's children and grandchildren is irresponsible. Comparable spending reductions would be in the amount of at least $2 trillion. But as that does not even cover the interest on the debt, a $4 trillion spending reduction would be appropriate, and that's what we should be working on. Today we must ask ourselves, is this blessed country of ours disciplined enough to solve the debt problem through austerity and productivity? I think we can. I believe we can, but only if we break from the tradition of spending and raising our debt limit. Instead, we must pass H.R. 2560, the Cap, Cut, and Balance Act.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
With that, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Dakota.
Gentleman from North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we've been down this road before. Our country faces unprecedented debt. The House has worked to cut spending and reduce the deficit. But the Senate Democrat leadership and the Obama administration would rather raise taxes and mislead Americans with scare tactics rather than support these common-sense solutions. Solutions that would help get our country back on track. We cannot do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. Americans have tightened their belts, and they've made the tough choices. It's time for Washington to do the same. Our financial situation is a mess. It's going to be a long road to get our country back on track. But it's clear we can begin right here. We need to cut the spending, we need to cap the growth in government, and we need to balance the budget. I yield back.
Yields back. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would remind my colleagues that this provision that they're talking about, the constitutional proposal that came out of the Judiciary Committee, would prohibit the Congress from balancing the budget at 13% of GDP expenditures. It would say you cannot make that choice. It would also say you have to reach a two-thirds hurdle to reduce the special interest tax breaks for the purpose of deficit reduction. So we keep hearing about this balanced budget amendment without any mention from our colleagues that they've inserted these two devices into the Constitution that would limit our ability to balance the budget in a balanced way. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Would that we had the problem of this Congress over the last 2 years trying to balance the budget, with $1 trillion in additional stimulus spending, $2 trillion in the cost of Obamacare, $3 trillion overall added to the budget deficit. Would that be the problem that we look to the other side of the aisle to try to live within our means? Unfortunately, that's not the case, and that's the reason why, as our founders understood and as we spoke of Jefferson before, the need to try to constrain ourselves with cutting spending now, placing legislative caps on for tomorrow, and then going forward in the future with a constitutional balanced budget amendment. And with that, I yield now 1 minute to the gentlelady from North Carolina, who understands the importance of living within our means.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
I thank the gentleman. You know, the possible default of the federal government presents a near-term problem, which could have disastrous effects in the short term on our economy. But the bigger problem is long-term, because Washington's just been spending too much money for too darn long, borrowing 40 cents just about of every dollar we spend, most of it from China, and sending the bill to our kids and our grandkids. This bill to cut spending, cap, and then balance the budget is something that needs to be done. And we can't keep kicking the can down the road. You've heard that before, but it's true. You know, the responsibility is on us to do the right thing for tomorrow, for our families and everybody else. We balanced the budget almost some years ago. It's not impossible. It can be done if we have the courage to do it. 49 out of 50 states do it. So we need to remember there's no such thing as government money. It's the taxpayers' money. It's our job to be responsible stewards of that. We need to step up and take that responsibility and pass this bill.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's right. A few years ago during the Clinton administration, when they took a balanced approach to deficit reduction, we did run surpluses. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentle lady from Texas, Ms. Jackson.